And I was thinking, oh, that's why I'm making these levels. So I was engaged in the purpose, right? And all it was just context, right? Nothing actually changed in the gameplay. I'm very excited today, not just because I have cold brew. That is a reason. That's probably the main reason. I'm excited today because we're talking about narrative. If you know anything about my main content, I talk about narrative game design all the time. It's kind of funny because this is not the type of game that you would think, oh yeah, this has to do with narrative. The way that this game is contextualized is so funny. This game is Veggie Quest by Smart AI Games. What was kind of funny about this submission was that I broke it down and the game design is pretty perfect. So I reached out to the creator and I said, what do you want me to do here? The creator got back to me and he said, maybe you can give me some advice on the narrative. The idea is to show this MMORPG creation tropes in like a funny, sarcastic way. The tropes which are currently bringing down the MMO genre, like general greed, abusing players via various money-sucking mechanics, releasing unfinished products, abusing devs, etc. I don't see many ways to weave that narrative in between or inside the puzzle levels. Like outside of the intro and a few in-lore pop-ups, the only way seems to be just inserting cutscenes with funny overboard situations showing the implications. Pretty cool because this person has a pretty good grasp on what they're trying to do with the game, which is awesome. This game is really funny. What made this game so funny though, the idea behind the game is that you have these AI players in a dungeon and you have to create the dungeon so that the AI takes a very long time to get to the finish. The puzzle becomes make the AI take the longest route possible, which is funny in itself, but then it becomes a pretty hard puzzle game. Are there times that the AI thinks of something that you didn't think of, right? There's plenty of those times in here. You're basically working as a level designer who's making these dungeons and you're being controlled or you're being told what to do by a producer. I'm going to talk about how to make a narrative for a game or how to write for a game. This became such an interesting topic for me because when I first got into game design, I was really enthralled with Portal. Portal still to this day is one of my favorite games. And the reason why is because of the way that it contextualizes the gameplay. This is something that I covered in the video on my main channel with Stories Untold versus Portal. The fact that I can look at Portal and I can be like, all of these test chambers are just basic levels that I've seen in other games, right? These aren't any different except that they use Portal technology. But what makes it so different is the fact that it's contextualized, trying to get out of this testing area. You're not just in puzzle 1, puzzle 2, puzzle 3. You're inside of a test chamber and you're a test subject and there's a robot telling you what to do. What's cool about that is that beyond the context, it's just a normal mechanic. So the reason why I bring up Portal and all that is because when Mark Laidlaw, who was the writer of Portal, talked about making the narrative for Portal, he said that you needed gameplay first. And that was the thing that was difficult with a lot of games, was that a lot of games would have like a story first and then they'd start putting in gameplay. But Portal is like gameplay that a story is written for. That's how I wanted to talk about this whole thing. I wanted to talk about Veggie Quest as gameplay that exists and then contextualizing it with a narrative. So the way that I'm going to go about this is I'm going to just make an example. I wouldn't think about this as a template because this is only for this game. It might work for other games, this kind of template way of thinking, but I'm not saying that this is like the way you have to write stories for your games. This is a way that I think worked for this way. This game doesn't really have that much of a story. This game has an idea, and I think the idea is really funny. Let me tell you what happens. I play the first level, right? And the first level is trying to elongate a dungeon so that it feels boring to complete. And then once you do that, then your producer pops up and says something like, hey, this is great. So many people are buying tickets to like skip this level. That's the kind of stuff that we're doing here. And I think that's so funny. But then, you play level 2 and then level 3 and that's it. Like the narrative is just lost. So I wanted to basically create that, right? I wanted to create some sort of narrative or a sequence of events that actually happens so that we can use it to contextualize the gameplay. So what I did was I thought about story structure. Very basic story structure was Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Premise, conflict, and resolution. That's the most basic kind of story you can do. And I thought about what the player is doing in this game. And the gameplay in this game is about the player facing harder and harder puzzles. So I figured, okay, let's make the story about the player facing harder and harder puzzles. So I broke that down into Acts 1, 2, and 3. And what that looks like is, so Act 1 is the player finds themselves making levels that take longer and longer to complete. Act 2 is the player finds that creating these levels is getting harder and harder. Act 3 is that the player faces the hardest challenge and then overcomes it. I just kind of made up Act 3 because the demo doesn't really have a resolution. So that's me splitting up the gameplay into kind of a story-like structure. What you do from there is you have to figure out the purpose of why the story exists. And this usually comes in form of a theme, right? The theme is what the author is trying to say about a subject. So the theme for this could be anything, but I imagine since we're trying to poke fun at big AAA companies that have blood-sucking tactics, that maybe what we want the theme to be is something about an evil corporation and how the protagonist beats the corporation somehow. So keeping that theme in mind, what we want to do is give purpose to each of those story beats that we made. And how we do that is very, very simple. We just ask why. So for example, the first one would be, why does the player find themselves making levels that take longer and longer to complete? So keeping the theme in our mind, an answer to that could be, the player is hired by a corporation to create levels, but is essentially tricked. The player thinks that they'll be making fun levels, but finds that the levels are actually supposed to be making the audience play longer and longer. So then again, we ask why. For Act 2, we say, why does the player find that creating these levels is getting harder and harder? An answer to that could be, the player finds that making these levels is getting very difficult because the corporation is trying to stuff too many things into their game and relying on the player's level design skills to make any sense of it. And then if we do it again for Story Beat 3, then we say, why does the player face the hardest challenge and then overcome it? The answer that I had for that was, the player faces the hardest challenge because the CEO got caught in his practices and was ordered to show that levels aren't artificially long. So he gets all of his power-ups and tells the player to make a very easy dungeon, but the player succeeds in making the CEO a very hard dungeon and takes a long time to complete, and thus the CEO gets arrested. But that's the idea of taking the gameplay and writing a story for the gameplay. And what that does is it contextualizes every action. When I played this game, one of the first things that happened, having the producer pop up and tell me, hey, the players are trying to skip this level. What a great job you did. And while that was validating, it also engaged my mindset. And I was thinking, oh, that's why I'm making these levels. So I was engaged in the purpose, right? And all it was just context, right? Nothing actually changed in the gameplay, but the context of something that happened. So I craved that more. And the idea that we can then draw on the player more with more story beats, I think is great. So each of those story beats that we wrote out, we would just need to create gameplay so that it feels more like, the story is taking place. And this is not, a suggestion for this person to do. I'm not saying the developer needs to change their game, but this is the idea that I think about when I think about writing a story for a game. This is the way that I would go about it. In the first idea, where we have the player being tricked, that they're actually not making fun dungeons, but dungeons that just take a very long time. How I could see that working in the gameplay is that the player is told to just make a very basic dungeon, and basically you'd use this as a tutorial. Introduce the player as a new hire for this company and say, hey, welcome aboard, go ahead and make us a dungeon here, show you how to do everything. It's a very easy challenge, and that's just try to connect the player with the exit. That's basically it. After a certain point, then the player can be chastised. The CEO or the producer or whoever comes over and says, no, you have to make them long because we have to charge microtransactions. So then the player, begins to see that the puzzles are involved, and the puzzles are about longer and longer gameplay. Then as that happens, then we look into the second story beat where the player finds more and more difficult puzzles. And the way that I wrote this is a little weak. The company is showing their greed, right? And this is a big second act, basically. This is the entire game. And the way that I thought about this is I already knew that this game has a lot of characters involved because that's part of the lore description on its Steam page. So I figured, why not try to take that and put it into the story? And the idea that I had was that each of the characters represent a different type of upgrade that the game developers are just kind of squeezing into the game. And the idea here is that they keep putting stuff into the game, thinking that it's going to engage players a lot more, and then rely on the player to make sense of it. Like, we've given them the ability to sneak around corners. Now, make levels that make that really difficult to do. We've added a new character into the game, a wizard that can teleport around walls. So start making levels that makes that really hard to do. Maybe each puzzle that comes across the table is presenting something new that the corporation is just being really, really surface level about and being really greedy about, and trying to not really think about the process at all, but just trying to shove a bunch of stuff, into the face of the game. And it's up to the player to make sense of all of it. It's the player's job to then keep making really bad levels. Maybe the protagonist in the game tries to escape, from making these types of maps. And then I was thinking that the third act could basically be that kind of boss fight, right? The boss fight being that the CEO themselves or the producer themselves, they're being sued for the amount of time that it takes to complete their game is very artificial, and they're trying to do this on purpose. And the CEO says, no, I can complete this game in, a very easy amount of time. It's up to the player to make the dungeon really, really difficult for the CEO. And now what they're doing is they're doing it for a good reason, right? Now the player is triumphing over the evil. That is just one way you could do something like this. Obviously, I just made all this up, but I feel like that kind of way of thinking, that whole thing about how story can recontextualize gameplay, I think that's really strong. And I think that's somewhere that you can start if you're trying to figure out how to add narrative into the game, is to just recontextualize the gameplay that you have. And then once you do that, make the gameplay a little bit more cohesive with your story, and then do a little give and take, until you're finished. I think this is so cool to have a game that you want to inject narrative inside of. The narrative doesn't have to be so straightforward like that. It doesn't really have to be a traditional narrative. Those are my thoughts on narrative in gameplay and stuff. This is Games Over Coffee Consulting, and this is where indie developers will submit their games, and I do my best to give feedback on their game design. If you're watching this and you're a game developer, you can submit a game to me if you'd like. There's a link in the description where you can do that, or you can go to gamesover.coffee, and there you can see a lot of other stuff. So there's also a main channel that I have. This is my second channel. So thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you guys later.